I'm Susan Hunt-Stevens, founder and CEO of WeSpire. Welcome to WeSpire Live, the last one for 2022. And what a 2022 it has been. So I think we're all in that like, whew, this is a good year to put behind us, and excitement for 2023 is certainly weighing on most people I know's hearts and minds. So I am thrilled today to be joined by two people whose work I have been so impressed with in very different ways, but all aligned passionately around the topic of ESG and CSR. So Maribel Lopez is joining us, and Christine Riley-Miller is joining us. And I'm going to start by having Maribel introduce herself, and then Christine will introduce herself, and then we'll get started with the conversation.
Hey, I'm Maribel Lopez. I'm the founder of Lopez Research. We're a technology market research and consulting firm looking at how technology is changing organizations in all kinds of ways, particularly in the past 2 years.
Great, Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Riley-Miller. I lead ESG at Beigene. We're a global biotech company, and I've been doing ESG since it was CSR and then sustainability. So lived through the evolution of this field, and look forward to the conversation today.
And living through the evolution is certainly how I think many of us in these roles and feel. So let's talk about 2022 and ESG and CSR. What do you two think some of the most notable themes for this year, if you look back, will be in this space specifically? So Christine, do you want to start?
Sure. I think, from my perspective, it's the rise of ESG as a more public issue for politicians and regulators. So we're seeing, we talked earlier about the politicization of ESG and whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. We're seeing regulations in Europe and in the US that any of us that are in the field are going to have to comply with, particularly for publicly traded in the US. And that regulation is really leading towards more data. And so we're all, I think, grappling with how do we collect, manage, and report data that is more consistent, that is more auditable, and that enables us to really demonstrate progress, but there's just such a wide field of data that we need to collect across all ESG issues, but in particular climate and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and human rights in their supply chain.
Now, Maribel, you have this vantage point where you see across all sorts of companies and all sorts of industries. And so from that standpoint, what themes popped out in 2022 for you?
Well, some of them were just mentioned, but maybe a slightly different angle on that. One of the things that I saw was that all of a sudden, companies both large and small, it seemed like CSR and ESG were larger company trends a few years ago, but now they sort of span any size organization. So that's one thing we're seeing. The second is we're really seeing a shift in the employee workforce in the sense of their care and desire to have discussions about CSR, ESG, DEI within organizations. So there's a lot more vocalness about those topics than we've ever seen in the past. Another one that happened as a result of issues around the pandemic was really companies starting to focus on wellness as part of ESG, and an acknowledgement that there was both a mental and a physical wellness that we had to start to think about with people working at home. There were some real positives in terms of people having a better understanding of maybe the human aspects that we hadn't thought about before, how people deal with caregiving, what types of environments they might live in, and how we might need to be more flexible in terms of thinking about what the workforce should look like, what the hours should look like, what the locations should look like. So those are some of the big trends, whether or not it was distributed, hybrid, remote, if that was okay. We used to talk about it being okay, but honestly, really nobody did anything. And now it's like, oh, we have to really think about how could we make this work if 10, 20, 50% of the employees don't come back to an office.
It's a very interesting question in ESG and this intersection of ESG and the future of work that we see, obviously, given what we do each and every day. And so there are certain jobs that just cannot be done remotely, and that you've got to enable people to thrive and do great work when they're together. And then there's jobs where it's actually better to do it remotely. I have heard more people who have what I would call thinking jobs. They write, they code, they draw, they, have to really think long and hard strategically and do presentations. That this open air office space we were all moving to, it was actually a giant distraction, and they sort of reclaimed their productivity when they're able to work from home and found themselves way more productive at work. And yet I worry about like young people, and who do they watch and who do they learn from, and how do they, we weren't very good at writing things down and training people. So a lot of people just learn by watching the people around them. And so I think that that is also that sort of intersection, as you said, between all these things that are happening with people in their lives, with the planet, with communities, and all of that, and how people work is just it's an exciting place to get to work. I feel privileged every day to get to be at that intersection right now. Let's talk about one of the major events that had all sorts of impact in different areas of ESG, and that is Ukraine. What have you seen in, both internally and, Christine, in your organization, and sort of how that's, having an impact, and Maribel, that you're seeing kind of across organizations, because, there's obviously the humanitarian response that was almost unprecedented, but it's creating energy, situations that are almost, unprecedented in Europe in particular. How are companies grappling with that geopolitical giant event of 2022, and what are you expecting for 2023?
I guess I'll start quickly on a more broader landscape. You meant, so I saw several things happen. One of the things I think really changed how we think about the world is the notion of agility. And we discovered, with a lot of different things, the supply chain issues we had throughout the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, that some of the management styles and practices and theories we thought could break pretty easily. Like just-in-time manufacturing is a great example of it was very difficult to execute on that. We had a lot of companies that we were speaking to that were talking about the social responsibility of whether or not they had to exit certain markets and certain aspects of their business. And if they were going to do that, they needed to try to do it quickly, and they needed to try to figure out the impact on the business and what they might replace certain revenue streams with, certain commodities that they had to deal with. So this was not really easy, and I think it really made people rethink, what are my contingency strategies, but also, when do I need to tick over? Like, for lack of a better phrase, like, how bad does it have to get before I have to change my business? And I think that is something that if you went back, say maybe 3, 5, 10 years ago, we haven't really seen that order of magnitude of need or desire to change. And I think there used to be a very big wall between what was CSR and what was business. And now we're not seeing that wall anymore. Organizations have to change. And that is, that's been a tremendous shift, and in a very short period of time. So I think in a lot of ways that shows that we in humanity are trying to evolve and, trying to do the right things when we can, but it's not without its challenges. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure Christine has, a lot to say about this.
Yeah, I think the struggle with Ukraine in particular is that, companies have the closest parallel they might have would be a disaster response right? You know, something, tornado, hurricane, we know how to make a donation. We have a set of criteria about when and why and how much we give. But Ukraine didn't fit into that. It's not a natural disaster, and it's, you know, it was on such a scale that companies really had to think carefully about, how do we respond? We have businesses there, as Maribel said. How do we make a decision about whether or not we contribute in what could become a very political response from different countries around the world? And how do if we're a global multicultural company, how does our response, what does that mean for our employees, and how do we need to be responsive to the kinds of questions our employees are asking? And for our industry in particular, biotech, you know, we have we may have patients who are in clinical trials or getting drugs in countries that other companies were pulling out of, right? And so we don't, you know, we didn't want to leave those patients without, you know, the life-saving drugs that they needed. And so, you know, we really looked at it as, how do we support the humanitarian response in that place and keep ourselves separate from what might be the broader geopolitical issues? And how do we ensure that we stay true to our mission of access to the medicines that people need? But it does, I think, you know, for us internally, there was a conversation around what, you know, how do we think about this? How do we frame this, you know, situation that's going on? What do we even call it? You know, do you say it's a war? Do you say it's an invasion? How do you, you know, because there are a lot of different ways of you know, talking about what was happening. And so it does, I think, force companies to say, oh, we have to really tackle some of these issues and conversations that aren't as, you know, don't fit into this neat set of criteria that we've been using in the past. And employees have a lot of opinions, you know, whereas before you could have made a donation and they were like, that's great. And, you know, thank you I love working for a generous company. But now if you do something that the employee disagrees with and thinks you should have done more or something different, you're going to hear about it. So you have to think about it through a very different kind of lens than I think, you know, we did certainly earlier in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, what we've talked about in some of the opening comments is that we are in this transition, and it's this transition that's requiring more agility, more transparency, more global mindset, more, you know, systems mindset, that it's all connected. And when you move a lever here, it has an impact there that you have to really understand. Where do you think companies are on this kind of CSR to ESG, sustainability to ESG, D&I to ESG journey? And there's a great question on, what do you think some of the biggest challenges for ESG executives and companies, you know, is going to be as we approach this next year?
So I saw Courtney's question. Thanks for that. And I want to pick up on something Christine just said, because I think it gets to the question about the biggest challenge. I see organizations really struggling with one of two challenges. There are many, obviously, and it depends on the organization. But one is exactly what Christine was referring to, and that's that employees are very vocal. They have they're putting extreme pressure on executives and senior staff in 22 and into 23 about, we want you to make some motion on this. And I think the problem that executives have is twofold. One, that they have to, you have to decide, back to what I was saying earlier, like, how bad is it before you do something, right? And you also just can't go back and forth and solve the whims of everybody, right? Because people in your organization will have differing viewpoints, which can be polarizing to each other. The viewpoints of the organization might be polarizing to some of the clients that you serve. So for executives, they really have to decide, like, how deeply involved are we going to be in external ESG efforts? And you have to be very good about communicating what those boundaries are, so that the employees know that, okay, that probably is crossing a boundary and you aren't going to do something about it. And then it's going to be unpopular. So some people are going to be really unhappy with you, and you have, at some point, you have to be okay and say, this is what it is. And the employees either have to be with us or not with us on it. And we respect the fact that if you're not with us, you might choose another job. Right. So I think I think there's responsibility on both sides. If you don't like the way your company is acting and you don't feel they're ethical, then you should go someplace where, you believe that they have the right values. As a company, you have to really balance how deep you go into some of these things. And then the second side is also something that Christine mentioned, and that was around how do we track? We signed up for a lot of big goals across the board. And, they were all like, by 2030, we're going to do this. Well, you know what? 2030 comes pretty quickly. And you have to start showing progress towards 2030 in 2023, 2024. So what are the systems that we use to monitor, measure those, and see if we're actually gaining progress? That was a long answer, but it's kind of complicated.
Nobody says this evolution is easy in any way, shape, or form. Christine, what are you seeing? Some of the, you're in a large organization trying to catalyze all of the, outcomes to deliver against big, hairy, audacious goals. What do you see as the challenges that you and your peers are having, and what are the big opportunities that get you excited about what's coming in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to sound like a broken record on this probably, but I think some of the real challenges are really understanding the regulatory environment and tracking it, so you might, if you're required to respond now to the CSRD, then you might be trying to figure out how do we comply with that. And for us, we're not yet required to comply with it, but I still feel an obligation to follow, what is it? What will we need to do? Because at some point we will need to comply with that. And am I ahead of what those reporting requirements are so that I'm in a good place to be able to comply when I need to? And then as part of that, data is the other piece. Everyone I talk to, all of my peers in ESG are saying, what data management system are you using? Who, if you haven't yet, who are you talking to? How are you responding? And so I think data management and those platforms, whether it's for employee engagement, whether it's for broader ESG metrics to respond to rating and ranking organizations, CDP, UN, et cetera, GRI, or if it's really how are you collecting the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Those are all going to be something that all of us are figuring out for the next year. And so I think the bulk of our time is going to be on reporting still until we can figure out how to streamline that in a more efficient way.
Well, one of my favorite sayings is you can't manage it if you can't measure it, but once you start to measure it, now you have to manage it. And so it's like, so get that reporting in place, know what it is, and then we're going to have to manage it, to be able to hit our goals. In this evolution, one of the questions that's being asked is that, we've certainly seen this particularly in larger organizations, is that efforts were pretty siloed. CSR was over here, D&I was over here, sustainability might be here, well-being. Some people, I love, Maribel, that you said well-being is part of it, because we agree, we absolutely see it as part of it, but not everybody does. And so the question that the attendee is asking is, do you see that these things might end up separating again, or do you think they'll all start to continue to consolidate under kind of an ESG umbrella? And what makes you think that it might stay or come together more? And Christine, why don't you start, because you see it from the inside in terms of the structure in the organization, and then Maribel, I'd love to see what you're seeing from an industry standpoint.
Yeah, I think every company will always need someone who's going to manage the strategy overall, but I'm growing my team directly, but also working with my colleagues to grow their team, so that, for example, we have someone who's on our procurement team who can do manage the scope 3 work that we need to manage, engaging with our suppliers directly. And it makes more sense for that person to sit on that team because they own those relationships, and then they can really be embedded, and it becomes part of the way that team and that function operates. Same with, our DEI work is in our HR function, and so they own that piece, and they all have report dotted line into me, because everyone recognizes that I have an obligation to report across everything that we do as a business. But in order to ensure that we are integrated into how the company operates, and on a practical level, that we can get the budgets and the resources we need to do that, it's much easier if they're embedded in the organization than if it's, our team asking for every single thing. And then the person who's like, why is someone on your team trying to have a conversation with my suppliers? It's just easier if those relationships live with them. And so I think we'll still see some centralization in terms of managing the strategy and the reporting piece of it, but more integration into the business functions in order to actually achieve everything that we need to achieve.
Yeah, Maribel, what are you seeing? And one thing you mentioned is smaller companies. And so how are, there might be a different answer to this question depending on if you're talking about a larger organization versus a smaller organization.
Smaller organizations have the benefit of they don't have that many groups, but they also have the issue of they don't have that many people, right? So it's harder for them to dedicate resources that are specific to various ESGs because that's a full-time equivalent that they have to deal with. But they are doing it. The answer to your question is it's not an easy one because it's not a one size fits all. It has a lot to do with the type of organization. So for example, if you are, say, a consulting firm, there's a real difference in whether or not you need somebody specifically focused on scope 3, So I see that to Christine's point, for certain roles, it makes more sense to have that very related to that production process. Whereas if it were a more general knowledge workforce and some of what they're doing is really working on, energy consumption of the building and things of that nature, then they might be more centralized. So we're seeing that most organizations now want to appoint somebody to be responsible that reporting leads up to from various groups if they keep things in various groups. And then depending on the type of company, that group might have it all with everybody in it reporting to them and they're liaising with different groups. But I really think that depends on how broad your purview has to be with ESG and how specialized it is within certain aspects of it.
Right. And I think, the piece that we always go back to the companies we work with is materiality, and if you look at your ESG issues from a materiality lens and look at those things that, are in that top right box, they may end up having different owners just because, if you're a tech company that manufactures products and services, you're going to have an environmental supply chain component, and you're also going to have a real D&I challenge, just based on the composition of most technology organizations. And so what you need to do to move the needle in those two areas, it takes very different skill sets, very different people, very different strategies. Yes, one person needs to, or one team needs to kind of own the goals, how we're tracking against the goals. But in terms of baking into the organization, I think the materiality ends up driving it a lot. Now, where we have fun is when we come in and look at, okay, what's highly material to the business, but what also can employees really do something about, in their roles, because there's certain issues that it's more of a central command and control or a single owner or things like that, versus there's some issues that require broader behavior change, or they're also highly passionate about. And that's been the thing that was sort of fascinating as we started to look at this, is that it might not be highly material to the business. And we actually ran into this, Christine, in some biotech companies. It might not be highly material to business, but employees care about so much that if you don't address it, they don't think you're actually authentic or impactful on those things they don't see. And so the thing we run into is employees care passionately about just like the waste in the cafeteria and whether there's composting and, and sort of this whole sense of, that the operations they come to work in each and every day support their sustainable values. And that might not end up being material relative to, energy being used by opening or closing hoods in the lab. But if they're passionate about it, you don't address it, it's like, well, they don't really care because we don't have recycling. And so
Right.
we realized that you kind of had to look at both of those things to be able to engage in a comprehensive way, is both materiality and passion, at least on the employee side. So there's a great question here around knowledge. And in fact, there might be like 4 or 5 questions around knowledge. So I'm going to try to see if I can package them up for you all, which is, an observation is that this person says, I see a lack of knowledge in ESG, and others said, ESG training and online learning is more in demand than ever, but it's a massive topic. How do we bring an entire workforce up to speed on this area that is new and complicated? What have you seen that works, and what do you, what are some best practices? So Maribel, I might start with you on this one and then go to Christine to hear more about some of the exciting work she's doing.
I feel like every answer starts with it depends, but, but okay. And what does it depend on is the way I'll approach this. When I see organizations trying to be successful with this, somebody in the organization has spent some time trying to figure out, for lack of a better term, what is the most broken thing. So, for example, you were talking about how in tech companies, there was a discussion about DE&I was the most broken thing for them. So they had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what would move the needle in DE&I. In other organizations, they really have to figure out carbon emissions, energy footprint, right? So that's where they're going to start, because, I think that the most successful efforts actually tie up to your KPIs and business metrics, because sometimes when those two things aren't aligned, you don't get funding for ESG is what happens, right? So you need to actually draw the bridge to how ESG, CSR, whatever your organization's calling it, impacts impacts your business outcomes. And if you can't do that, it's usually hard to get funding for anything. So training is kind of like whatever. But when you do that, people usually start with the most critical need and then work their way down, because that's the thing that you're probably trying to impact in the next year. There's lots of ways you could do it. You could try to do it from the ground up, but as somebody said on it, it's a pretty heavy lift. So I think the biggest issue with ESG is you can't, like any other thing, you can't boil the ocean. You have to start with doing something. And then once that something starts to get momentum, you can start to layer on. It's like the same land and expand strategy that you do for anything else in business.
Yeah, exactly. Christine, what are you seeing in terms of what you're having to, skill up your workforce on related to ESG broadly?
Yeah, I want to start by picking up on something that Maribel said, and that is, I think people are really intimidated by the term or the acronym ESG. But the reality is that the issues that I focus on have changed based on the company, the industry, and the sector that I'm in, not on the terminology that we're using. So when I was at 𝙒𝙚𝙎𝙥𝙚, my title was CSR. When I was at Samsonite, my title was sustainability. And now that I'm at Beigene, I'm in ESG. But the scope of issues that I'm still managing and reporting against is the same. They're just when you look at the materiality of those issues, that's where it changes. And so to Maribel's point, I think you really have to say, you can't boil the ocean. You have to look at your materiality assessment and say, okay, where are we with these material issues? Where is the company behind? Are they not doing enough on DEI&B and DE? We call it diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So DEI&B, and how do you train and educate people on what that means for your industry and your sector and your company? And how do you look at what your own gaps are and where you want to be and where you are? And then you really focus on educating people on that issue. And then when you look at things like climate and carbon, what's important? If you're not publicly traded, then some of that regulatory stuff is probably not that important. Or to your point, if you're, a public service company versus, or a consulting company versus a heavily manufactured or consumer goods company, your climate strategy is going to be different. And so you really have to focus on educating people on, here's what we need to know. And so for me, a lot of it is around educating people on, here it is again, the regulation that's coming to say, hey, this is why we developed the climate strategy that we're doing this year. It's because we're going to have to report this information as part of our SEC filing. And so you might not want to invest those resources because you might think, oh, climate is an afterthought, but actually it is critical to who we are as a company and how we operate, because we do have to file. And so when you're thinking about those, where you focus your energies, you really have to look at your own company, what those material issues are, and then how you're going to bring people along. But you can't do everything. I mean, there's a whole host of issues I'd love to work on. We don't have capacity for it, and we'll get there when we solve for the ones that are the most material.
Absolutely. So there's a couple questions that are on people's mind about what we theorize might happen with ESG in an economic downturn. Do you think that the regulatory tailwinds are strong enough that at this point we just have to do this kind of irregardless of what's happening economically? Or do we think that we're going to see de-emphasis, slowdown, cuts in ESG programs and people because of what's happening potentially in the economy?
I think if you are, for me anyway, there are areas where if the SEC regulation goes through, we'll have to continue to invest regardless of the economic downturn. I think let's be honest, and maybe there are folks on the call who have had very generous budgets and more resources than they know what to do with, but most of us in this space are constantly fighting for budget. And so for me, if you lived through the pandemic, if you've lived through the recession of 2008, like, your budgets have been cut. You're always fighting for it. So I think it's not going to be anything new to practitioners in the field. It's just a, Groundhog's Day of, all right, someone's asking me to give money back, and it's easy to give money back because it's considered charitable. And, so I think it does go back to what Maribel was saying earlier, is that the more you can tie those programs into a business need, which is often easier said than done, if there's a lever that you can pull, like, I feel very fortunate that I have the regulatory lever to pull to get some of that climate budget, but you might, and you probably have the employee lever to pull on some of that DEI work, and this is why we need to fund ERGs, or this is why we need to, focus on diversity. There are other things that you might just have to look at and say, can I afford to let that one go now in order to ensure that I get the funding for the things I really need? But it could be affected by that downturn, but we've all been asked to give money back all the time.
Absolutely. We're very used to operating on lean budgets in this space.
I mean, I've had the other say to me, like, this is the talk about tight budgets. I'm like, let me tell you about tight budgets.
Exactly. Exactly. The other thing that I would just really emphasize, is my experience now leading organizations through this will be a third, if there was a third, or we're in the middle of, or the beginning of a third, is that sometimes it actually catalyzes innovation, because sometimes the status quo, particularly in things that should be coming together, is inertia for getting those things to come together. And the economic downturn is actually the catalyst for having to rethink how things are done. And so, from where we sit, what we see is a lot of silos, a lot of duplicative systems, things that don't talk to each other, people who don't work together. And we can be a catalyst for making that happen, and save people money. At the time, it wasn't a material enough amount of money necessarily outside of a recessionary environment. But when you're looking for sort of turning over every rock, all of a sudden, wait, maybe we should be more collaborative. Maybe we shouldn't have duplicative systems. Maybe we should rethink it. And, Maribel, I saw this with the marketing stack in the sort of 2008 timeframe, where finally that's when we all got rid of our, channel specific systems and started actually doing integrated, marketing things. And I think the same thing is going to happen probably with ESG. If there's economic pressures, just even more collaboration, more innovation, and things like that. But there's a question, Maribel, that I think you would be best positioned to answer. And it's a fascinating question because it involves crypto, to warn you. So,
okay.
Which is, given the recent FTX crypto scandal, how will the negative perception of ESG investing impact our work? And I'm not sure I necessarily saw the connection between ESG investing and FTX, but I might be living under a rock. But I do think this question of the connection between crypto broadly, or the blockchain broadly, and ESG is a very interesting one, and one, given what you do, that I'd love to hear your perspective on.
Well, okay, so there's a couple different things in there, right? So I think if we wind it back a little bit, it wasn't the fault of ESG. So the methods that people choose to invest in certain things, I think if you are doing speculative investments, there's an inherent risk with that. So then you have to say, is that a risk that you would have wanted to put around any of your business efforts, ESG or not, right? So there's that. There are good ways and bad ways to use blockchains, I think, is what we've discovered as a result of this. And in a way, I think it's pretty sad, because I actually liked the idea of we saw a lot of good projects that started with concepts around blockchain. And then we kind of went into some really interesting areas of crypto and what crypto was valued for. Do I think it's going to impact ESG in general? No. Do I think it impacts how people think about the various ways that you can fund, track, monitor, manage investments, outcomes, other things? Yes, I think we're having a lot of discussions around that right now. And I think that's a good, healthy thing. And I also believe there'll be a lot of discussion around regulation that will happen as a result of this. And those two things are at odds, given that, clearly crypto is not about regulation, and this is what happens when it's not about regulation, you get fraud. So brings
the G of ESG to life.
Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that there were some good things that we started in and around the blockchain that I think I'd like to keep in terms of ledgers and the like. And there were some more speculative things that weren't very well articulated or able to be tracked or monitored, but I think that's a problem. I also think it speaks to, as an organization, you need to really think about what would be the responsible thing to do if I were called on this, like, how am I going to defend the choices I've made, right? So that's for everything in life, but it goes in business, it goes in ESG. You don't skip it anywhere in life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about G, we've talked a decent amount about the regulations that are coming on the E side. Let's talk about metrics in the S for a second. And we have a question from the audience on, do we think there will ever be standard measurements for the S? And what do we think will directly influence how S is measured and reported differently from how people are doing it now?
I do have one comment on this, because I had this discussion with a client of mine recently, something similar to this. And one of the things that I hadn't personally thought about that I think organizations need to think about is, if you're looking at standardization, it assumes that everybody starts in the same place. So, and that's an issue. That's even an issue when you look at a country by country level of what's possible, what's culturally acceptable within certain countries. So some of what we talked about was, perhaps it was not standardized, but it was an improvement from where you were, a percentage improvement from where you were. And that allows everybody to sort of participate. And then you have to figure out, well, are the percentages different in different countries? One of the things this came up with was women employment within certain industries. You know, how fast would that be in different areas of the globe, right? Based on either available talent, social acceptability of certain roles, that kind of thing. You know, everybody would agree in a humanitarian sense that you wouldn't want to have child labor. So it's like, okay, you've got a, anti-child labor goal. Well, okay, in 2023, is that really the right goal? Like, should we be pushing the goal forward from there? You know, what would be the next iteration beyond that goal? So I think when you talk about standardization and in the social aspect of goals, it's very hard to do, both on a geographic level and on a, I think you always have to look at, like, am I going to evolve my goals every year? And then the type of company I don't have any child labor that would even come into question within my field. So that goal would be completely irrelevant for me. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something to think about as you're approaching that concept of designing metrics.
So Christine, how are you all measuring S today, and where do you see this going over the next 12, 24, 36 months?
Yeah, I mean, we're measuring a lot of it qualitatively more than quantitatively. And to Maribel's point, trying to figure out what some of those consistent data points are across the industry. So for us, it would be things like access and affordability to medicines, and how do you establish a data set that every company can report against, and what does it mean? But I do think that there is going to be increased expectations around figuring out how to establish quantitative metrics for S eventually, because among the investor community in particular, there is an increasing need to be able to view comparable data across different companies and different industries. And so they might be starting with climate, and we've seen that a little bit with board diversity and some of the workforce diversity numbers, but I think we're going to start to see that in other areas of S. And so when we're thinking about it, I'm always thinking about how do we measure this from a quantitative standpoint? Can we get the data? What does the data tell us? Yeah. Is there a way to demonstrate progress, or is it just a reporting out? But I do think we're going to see more of a demand for consistent, comparable data that investors can use to evaluate broad ESG programs outside of just the E part.
And linking CSR and ESG here for a minute, one of the things I'm most excited about that we're working with some customers on is going beyond hours and dollars, and really looking at what do those hours and dollars actually do. And there's some really interesting new companies out there that are trying to really pull this data together in a more consistent way from organizations that do social impact programs to be able to tie back. So if an organization is, investing this much money or investing this many hours of their time, what's coming out of that from a social outcomes standpoint? And it's early days of this work as we're learning, but just even that transition, I'm excited about, because I think that ultimately it's great that an organization can say, well, we had this many hours of volunteering, but so what happened as a result of that? Why did that matter? Right. And things like that. And that gets, we had another question around metrics. So while we're on the topic of metrics, I'm going to ask this last one, and then we have a couple of meaty ones coming up to wrap up the conversation. But and Maribel, I'm going to warn you, the person asking this question knows this stuff. Maribel briefly mentioned the most important factor to success of ESG programs, which is linking them to business metrics. But frankly, we still all kind of suck at that. That is, I think, generally true. So are there great examples that you've heard of, that you've seen done? Are there things that that you think where people are really doing a good job of aligning ESG programs with business outcomes and metrics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I deal with maybe it's better for me to try to talk about things that are a little more public, because I have to think about like what's non-disclosure and not non-disclosure for me. And I spend a lot of time in half my business working with technology companies. So a lot of the technology companies I've been working with have had some pretty strong changes in goals around diversity, equity, inclusion within management, and they've had some pretty good upgrades. So if you look at Dell or Cisco, they have like really interesting metrics and CSR reports that they put out. I think Cisco's actually just came out a few days ago. We've in Europe, companies like Nokia and Ericsson have been working very hard on trying to deal with carbon and other issues. And there's a lot of work in the technology industry on reuse of product in terms of recycled product, and how that's both impacting their cost to manufacture and also impacting their ESG goals. So there are examples, some of, but the reality is a lot of them are still fuzzy. I can relate to that. You had mentioned earlier some of the discussion around money, and one of the things I thought was really interesting too is the intersection of marketing and HR and trying to attract talent into organizations.
Yeah.
And sometimes the vector of attracting talent within an organization is really highlighting what your ESG efforts are. Right.
Absolutely. And we certainly see that employees who are involved in your ESG programs are more likely to recommend the company, more likely to stay at the company. In certain programs, particularly interestingly enough, sustainability programs, more likely to become leaders in the company and supervisors. I think because sustainability is the ultimate lead by influence job, which is a core leadership capacity. But Christine, how are you tackling this connection between the ESG programs and business outcomes, either in this role or prior roles? And what do you see your colleagues doing that really, that you're like, oh, I think they're doing a great job on this?
Yeah, one of the evolutions that I've seen over the past like 2 years is that more of my colleagues know what ESG is. So, like you go into a company and the first thing you say is like, oh, I lead our sustainability efforts, and they think it's just the climate, and they ask, why are you asking me about diversity, equity, and inclusion or human rights? But now at my company, I can go and say to someone, who's working with our supply chain or our suppliers and say, hey, I need to talk to you about scope 3, and scope 3 is, and they say, no, I know what scope 3 is. I did it in my last job. And when the finance guy is saying, this is important, we need to do this, we need to figure out how to resource against it. I think there is a slow shift in some companies because people have had more exposure and experience to the work to recognize that it is good for business. And so I think as that grows, it makes our jobs easier. So I don't, in my role, and I feel very lucky, have to convince my, finance guy, my procurement guy that this is important for the people that I do. It's very much figuring out like, how is this going to support your objectives? It's having conversations with their team members, so I can go to them and say, hey, your team members are asking for this. This is why it's important. It's bringing them into the conversation from the very beginning. So when you do the materiality, get as many people who are going to be part of your strategy in that conversation, so that when you present it, you say, this is what you told us. And when you build the strategy, you say, oh, it's based on what you told us. And when you set the goals, you say it's based on the strategy you helped me create, that was based on the issues that you contributed to, so you bring them through that process. And the other thing I like to do is take the acronyms out of the conversation. So create the language in the language of the business, so it's not, oh, this is our ESG program. It's, here's our program that has a branded name for us, so we're, and our focus areas are in the language of the business, so people can see how their work contributes. And it's not just, oh, this person over here in corporate affairs that's doing our climate work. Yeah. And I don't get what it is.
I also think that when done well, and I've seen it done well in several organizations who were kind of early into this, people really see ESG as a key driver of growth. And growth is exciting, and growth is interesting, and growth is ultimately what organizations want, particularly if it's sustainable growth. And so one of the things that I really was impressed by some early WeSpire clients is just seeing the really hard work they did to connect their programs and what they were doing with ESG, whether it was sustainability or whether it was D&I or whether it was well-being, to not just kind of the operating metrics internally around costs and things like that, but really, how is this driving customer loyalty? How is this driving market share? How is this driving our revenue? How is this driving or changing or our ability to attract investors, the beta on our stock, all these things that really got into that. And I think when you can really start to tie these programs to that growth of the business, that's when I think that's when everybody who doesn't understand the acronyms starts to get it, is they're like, wow, this is actually driving core business. So a question that we have that I think is, I know something that several organizations that I work with have been having some really deep, fascinating, important conversations around, but we're the faces to the organization, and we're the organizations that are catalyzing, driving, setting goals around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our own organizations. How are we bringing Black and Brown voices into our own field and our own leadership roles? And what do you think we could be doing better on that front?
Well, I think, when I'm hiring a role next year, and I think you have to be careful and not to look for the person who has the same background as you, or the person, these are obvious things, right? But you have to look, you have to be open to candidates who might bring a different experience, because honestly, you can learn the work in ESG. If you can learn it. I'm not in the lab at our company, and if you can bring someone in who has a different kind of background, brings a different kind of experience, and give them the opportunity to grow in the field because they have the passion for it, I think we have to be open to not looking for people who have that skill set, because honestly, it is hard to find senior folks who have that skill set. And so you often have to hire for people who can grow into that role. And then you have to be open to where they live, who they are, what they can contribute. And so I think it's really easy to go with what but if we really want to grow the field and make, and diversify the skill set, particularly because the issues are so diverse now, I think we just have to keep an open mind to that.
Maribel, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to think about this, obviously. One of the things that I think is really important, and this could be Black or Brown voices, it could be age of employee, it could be gender. There's a lot of different, we don't have to actually specify it specifically on that. But it gets back to are you really trying to create a culture with diversity of thought? I think is the first thing that we have to think about, whether it's ESG or some other part of the organization. And while people say they are, they really aren't. So I think that's the first question that you have to ask yourself is, how open are you to some of the companies I deal with have extremely strong cultures, and it's not even that they couldn't hire someone, it's that someone does not necessarily feel like they are a good fit for that organization because the culture is too strong and too not like them, right? So that inclusivity discussion that we've been having, I think, is really important. The second one I think Christine brought up is a lot of the things we're trying to do, somehow we're still going out and looking for, the purple unicorn that is supposed to understand everything about this topic, and that's the person we're going to hire. when we really need to spend more time investing in the growth of individuals within a field. And that means that, hey, you hire somebody for curiosity and passion. And if they have curiosity and passion, they can learn what they need to learn about the job, and they'll be an extremely good advocate for that role and for the business. And I think a lot of our metrics right now for even how we funnel people through a hiring process are not geared to find curiosity and passion. They're geared to find, you have skill set ABC, right? So it's really a rethink of the whole process, and not just like I interviewed you and I seem to like you. It's because you're like me is typically like what Christine said. It's like, I like people that are like me. We got along great. Yeah, let's hire them. That's not the same as figuring out if they have curiosity and passion. And so that means an entirely different set of questions that we ask people, maybe even testing that we do or other things to see if they're a good fit for that role. So that's what I think has to happen if we really want to see a diversity of voices within an organization.
Yeah. And it was a comment in there prompted a response or a question that said, is diversity of thought whitewashing if we don't recognize other diversity first? It's an interesting.
So when we say other, so I think part of the other diversity is related to diversity of thought. I don't take them as separate things. So that would be my first comment. But, you know, sometimes I think when people think of diversity of thought, they might think we have difference in political diversity or things of that nature. There's socioeconomic diversity that creates differences in how you think about things. So it doesn't have to be just thought, I guess, but I do believe that thought is at the center of a human being. So, you know, I don't want it to be about like what color you are, what race you are, whatever you are. I want it to be about the intrinsic thing of you. And right now, part of the issue with the diversity and inclusion efforts is there's not about the intrinsic nature of the person. It's more about, I've got a checklist that says I need X number of whatevers. How do I get X number of whatevers by the end of the year? It's like, that's not the goal, really. The goal was really for us to create a diverse culture that would allow us to do things differently than we've done in the past, and to just be more open to the opportunities of what's different. So, yeah, I'm going to stop there because I'm like all soapboxy at the moment. But
well, and that we have 3 minutes for what is a big question. But I love that one of our question askers is forcing us to prioritize. So it's combining where do we see ESG heading in the next few years, and think each of you about what do you think the biggest topic in ESG is going to be over the next 12 to 24 months. And is there anything that would cause that focus to change? So Christine, I'm going to have you go first. What do you think the biggest topic is going to be over the next 12 to 24 months in ESG?
I think it's going to continue to be climate, and we'll see greater emergence around biodiversity issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're going to continue to see greater increased regulation around that. So more climate regulation, more focus on climate, with more questions around biodiversity specifically.
Yeah. What about you, Maribel? What do you think is the biggest topic for ESG over the next 12 to 24 months?
You know what, I'm just not going to call it, because we've got so many things that we could be doing, and it really depends on, you know, whether or not you have issues that are more employee related or more climate related. So it sort of depends on where you are, but a lot of opportunity, let's just say.
I think it's going to, you know, what I see is that there's going to be increasing seriousness about needing to have a more strategic, integrated, aligned with the business approach that has just continued to evolve, but the regulatory frameworks, the criticality to employees, and the fact that for employees for whom these topics are top of mind, they're going to be 76% of the workforce in the future, in the next 3 years, our leaders are becoming the people who are saying, we have to change how business is done. And so I really do believe that that ESG and the work that we do is increasingly going to be the corporate strategy. And that's an exciting place to be. And to your point, Maribel, what your corporate strategy is depends on the business you are in. But at the core of every business, the strategy is going to be, how do we build a more sustainable, more inclusive, healthier, more engaged in our community business? And how are we going to grow and innovate because of that? So that is the end of WeSpire Live. Maribel, it was so great to see you again and have you, Christine. I always love talking to you, and thank you so much. What a wide range of topics. Thank you to the audience for such great questions. I didn't have to do any work other than moderate. We're so happy that you were all here. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day and holiday season. And we will see you back in January 2023 for the next adventures in WeSpire Live. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.